Hey guys, thanks for coming to the pink room. I didn't understand much of the introduction except for the last part, and my Finnish is a little bit rusty, so I'm going to do this in English, if that's okay. I'm actually based in New York City, working for Accenture. I've been with Accenture for 16 years, and I run both our emerging technology practice in North America and Asia Pacific, as well as the new Liquid Application Studio that Accenture just launched over in California. And we plan to launch additional ones shortly. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that in my presentation. But what I'm going to talk to you guys about today is how IT delivery, how delivery of technology is fundamentally changing. And there's a fundamental shift in how companies perceive technology, how they use technology, how they deliver technology. Okay? That's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to start by explaining the context here and why that's important. I'm actually going to skip this slide. There's three reasons this shift is happening, okay? The first one is software and technology is fundamentally becoming a business differentiator. Years ago, technology was seen as an enabler of the business, right? You are a retailer, you perform some kind of a function, technology is an enabler of that function. Today, that's no longer the case. Today, technology is the differentiator. Software is often your business, no matter what your business is. It's obviously the business of companies like Microsoft that actually make, build, and sell software. But it's increasingly becoming the business of everyone, okay? Look at some of these examples. Alibaba, it was just actually, I think this week in the news, that Alibaba surpassed, as measured by revenue, Walmart to become the largest retailer in the world. They have already been valued as the largest retailer in the world in the markets for some time, okay? So Alibaba is competing with Walmart. They're competing with traditional retailers, but Alibaba is not a retailer. Alibaba is a software company. They're a bunch of engineers. They don't have any products. They don't make any products. They don't have distribution channels. They don't have warehouses. They are a platform. They're a technology platform. Software is their business, while they, of course, are in the retailer space. Airbnb, right? You guys all heard about Marriott and Starwood merging, right? I guess that's not happening anymore, but they were originally merging. The merged company, Marriott and Starwood, would have provided less rooms every night than Airbnb. Airbnb is the largest accommodation provider in the world today. Do you guys use Airbnb here? Right? Everybody's heard of Airbnb, I'm sure. They are the world's largest accommodation provider. They don't own a single hotel room. They don't have any hotel staff working for them. They're a software company. They're a bunch of engineers. For these companies, and increasingly for traditional businesses, technology and software is becoming their business. At the very least, it is becoming a differentiator. How many of you guys have heard of a company called Etsy? I don't actually know if Etsy's, oh, okay, great. So Etsy, actually their headquarters is about a 20-minute walk from my house in Brooklyn, New York, right? They have their headquarters there. And Etsy, of course, is a company, for those of you guys that don't know, they're a retailer. They're a retailer platform like Amazon, but they focus on handcrafted goods, right? If you don't know who they are, ask your daughters and wives. They probably order stuff from Etsy. They make handcrafted goods, and people that make those things can sell it on Etsy, right? This is the kind of stuff Etsy's doing with technology, right? They are evolving their product to tailor to their customers on a continuous basis, right? What this means is that they can change your experience many, many times a day. Software is their product, and they're able to change it on a continuous basis, right? So software is becoming everyone's business. And companies that were born in digital age, the Googles of the world, the Facebooks of the world, they have achieved an incredible amount of efficiency in how they build software. If you look at some of these numbers, this is measuring how many users are supported by one engineer in each of these companies. It's an interesting measure, right? But at Google, almost 90,000 users are supported by each engineer. And if you look at Facebook and Amazon, it's in the hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of thousands, 600, 700,000 users are supported by each engineer in their company. So software is their business. It's increasingly a business differentiator, and they're delivering it with scary efficiency. But in many ways, these companies here, Google, Facebook, and Amazon, they're kind of legacy in this new IT space, right, in the new digital world. They have been around for a while. They are established. They have large organizations. And if you look at some of the new ones that are emerging out there, right, you look at a company like WhatsApp, right, the second point I want to make emerges, right, the second point of why IT is fundamentally changing. And it's because of platforms. Look at WhatsApp. WhatsApp, actually, these numbers are a bit dated. I just read that WhatsApp has 1 billion users. They just surpassed 1 billion users, and they have 57 engineers, I believe. Right? The ratio is still about the same, 20 million users per every engineer. Right? How are they able to achieve it? Well, they're able to achieve it because of platforms they rely on. In today's world, these companies no longer have to build their data centers, build out software over the course of years and spend billions of dollars before they go to market. They can rely on platforms provided by Amazon. They can rely on crowdsourcing platforms that are out there to build out their products and capabilities very, very quickly, very rapidly, stand it up overnight, and compete and disrupt markets, right? So platforms like Amazon, platforms like crowdsourcing capabilities, they have removed the barriers to entry for businesses. And that's why today, companies like WhatsApp, like Instagram, can be born overnight and have a very, very meaningful impact. So that's the second reason technology delivery needs to change, is because of these platforms. And finally, and maybe my favorite reason, is all of you guys, all of us in the room, and our expectations of technology. We fundamentally expect products and services to be personalized, to be tailored, to be unique. I don't want to have the same experience as you have. You want to have a different experience than your spouse has, than your daughter has, than your parent has, right? Everybody wants to be unique. And the expectations we have of technology continues to change at a really, really scary pace. I have a 9-year-old son, and we were in a hotel a couple of months ago, last year, I think, and he woke up in the morning. I carried him into the room because he was asleep. We were driving somewhere, and it was like one of these little hotels that we just stayed by the road. And I woke up in the morning, and he's standing in front of the TV, okay? And he says to me, "What is that?" I said, "What do you mean, what is that? It's a TV." He said, "Yeah, but why is it so big?" And I realized he's never seen a tube television before, right? And then the next thing he was trying to do, he was trying to swipe the screen on it, right, to change channels. He didn't like the cartoon he was watching, so he was trying to swipe it, right? My daughter, who's a year old, right, she doesn't talk yet, but she can operate an iPad or an iPhone or an iWatch with no problems at all, right? It's like kids today are born with this stuff, right? And the expectations we have of technology is dramatically changing. It's changing very, very quickly. I remember when I was in school, beepers were a big thing. I don't know if they were in Finland, right? You guys remember beepers, when you'd get a page and you'd find the nearest payphone, right, to call back, to call your whoever was texting you. I was at a lunch on Tuesday with Dan Doctoroff. Dan Doctoroff is the deputy mayor of New York City in the Bloomberg administration, so the previous administration of New York, and he was a very technology-focused guy. He's now working he's got a company that he started that's part of the Alphabet Google conglomerate, and they're changing out all the phones in New York City, all the phone booths, right, to have these like Android tablets there and provide Wi-Fi, right? No more landline phones. So technology expectations we have are fundamentally changing. How many of you guys have been to Disney World in Florida? How many of you guys have been there in the last year? How many of you have heard of the Magic Band program at Disney? Okay, cool. Many of you guys knew that Accenture was a technology delivery partner with Disney that did that. So I ran technology integration for Walt Disney World for 2.5 years. If you go to my IoT session later on today, I'll talk a lot more about how we built that application and what some of the challenges were. But I think Disney is a great example of what they did with Magic Band that exemplifies personification that we expect from technology, right? One of the reasons they did this, and what they did, by the way, at Disney, is they transformed the experience of the guest. You now get a connected band when you go to the park, and that band is your ticket into the park. It's your room key. It is your way to experience unique things in the park, right? So characters can approach you and wish you happy birthday because they know who you are and you know that they're your favorite character. So very, very cool stuff. And the reason they did that is because they wanted to attract the millennial generation, right? The families, young families with parents in their 20s and 30s that are now having kids, They want them to come to the park, and they felt like that was a demographic they were losing, okay? Because they have an expectation of a seamless experience, of a simple experience, of an easy experience, and of a personalized experience, right? So those are the three things that I think are the fundamental reasons why how technology is looked at by businesses and how it's delivered needs to change and needs to shift, okay? But while that's the case, if you look at a lot of traditional businesses, you look at Fortune 500, Global 2000 companies, their IT and their capability to deliver technology is fundamentally slow. Why is that? Well, I put up 3 reasons because I like everything in threes. So the first reason I think that traditional IT is slow today is because of a very heavy operating model. If you look at most organizations today and you ask them, what does it take for you to make a change to a technology system, be it an IT system that supports your enterprise or be it a product or a service that you're offering your customers, what does it take to change it, right? Because most often they can't change it, every minute, which is the presentation next door, or 250 times a day, like Etsy does. So when you look at what it takes to deploy something, what it takes to make a change, you find that the base cost of doing a release of technology is so high, the processes associated with it, the manual steps, the permissions that it needs to go through, there's so much of that base cost that making a small change doesn't make any sense, right? And so organizations shift to these large, there's resistance to do anything small because of the overhead cost. So everybody shifts to these releases, right, and deployments that are very large and therefore take longer. The other thing I find is a lot of my clients, when you look at a portfolio of applications they have, portfolio of systems, right, and let's say you look at a portfolio of 500 applications, when you go in there and you analyze what those applications look like, what architectures they have, when you look at how they're built and designed, there's 500 different ways, right, that those 500 applications are built. They use 500 different stacks, they use 500 different styles, they use 500 different architectures. What that means is they're creating all this debt to manage, right? The more applications they have, the more complexity they have, the more different styles of architectures they have, the more components they need to manage and deal with, right? So they're increasing this complexity as they grow their portfolio. And finally, it's about productivity, right? The productivity of their engineers is actually very poor, and I have a good example of that. This is from an actual client. I won't say who it is, but this is from an actual client, pretty recent, and I don't think this is much different, frankly, than a lot of large enterprises that I've looked at, so this is not a very unique scenario. What we did here in this analysis is we measured the productivity of an engineering team. And we did that very simply. We asked a very simple question. We wanted to know the percentage of time people spend hands on keyboard writing widgets that support some business requirement, okay? Whether it's code or documentation or testing, right? But they're working on that widget that fulfills a new requirement, right? And we wanted to measure how much time they're spending doing that versus everything else. Everything else being, I'm in a status meeting, providing a status report. I am helping the release team with, my new feature. I'm fixing a bug from the previous release, right? I'm clarifying requirements because they're poorly written. I'm sitting down with the business. Whatever it is, right? Everything else other than spending time on keyboard building applications. And when we looked at a total capacity of the team, which was about 5,000 hours across a given sprint, right? We found that right off the bat, the amount of work that was sent to the team was only for less than half of that time. So the amount of work that team was given, based on the estimate, was 46% of that time. And when we looked at what was actually delivered, well, it was actually 19% of their time. The things that were going in production took 19% of that time. That means that for every hour they were building widgets, they were spending 4 on something else. And this was not a team that was leaving at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. These guys were working really hard. They were staying late, they were coming in early, they were working weekends, and they were really frustrated, right? This is what we see in a lot of traditional enterprises. And the reason this is happening is not because the team is dumb or they're slackers, right? It's because of the processes and inefficiencies in the model that a lot of large enterprises have. When we look at how does this happen? How can you allow for this to happen? And when we look at that, when we ask that question, we realize that many organizations, they don't measure the right things. When I show this to the CIO of that company. This is a very large Fortune 500 company. When I showed that analysis to the CIO, I first didn't tell him it was his company. I first said, hey, look at what we found. And he goes, that's crazy, right? I can't believe that there's organizations out there that are so inefficient. And I said, well, guess what? This is actually one of your programs. And he said, well, first he was kind of baffled. Then he said, well, you know what? It doesn't surprise me because we've never asked this question. We don't measure this. So I said, well, what do you guys measure, right? And when you look at what enterprises measure, they often measure the wrong things. They're often measuring things like unit cost, right? How much am I spending per hour per engineer? Why is that important, right? They're measuring how many builds I can do in an hour, right? Which is an interesting metric, but fundamentally, what does that mean for your business? So these are the things I think you have to be measuring, right? And I think it's 4 things. So I'm moving away from my groups of 3. First is throughput. You've got to measure how much stuff is flowing through a team, right? Not what your unit cost is, but how much throughput you're getting. Secondly, don't measure how many builds you can do in a minute. Measure what your cycle time is. From the time I say, I want to move this button that's on the top left-hand side of the screen to the bottom right in a production application, how long does that take? Does it take a day? Does it take a week? Does it take a month? How long does that take? You also want to be, of course, measuring quality because just because you get high throughput doesn't mean you're actually producing something of value, right? You want to make sure that the defect densities you have in your downstream environments as well as in production are low. And finally, you want to measure, this is very important, operations cost, right? How many of you guys have been part of a team that was doing design and development of an application? How many of you guys from day one considered operations requirements? Right? This is an issue because at the end of the day, that application has to be operable. It has to run, okay? And most often we see teams not thinking about that from day one. And it's very, very important to think about it from day one. And I'll tell you why in a second. So what are some of the levers traditional enterprises are pulling, right, to drive efficiency and scale and improve some of these things? Well, the traditional approach is if we are behind, if we're slow, if we're not meeting our deadlines, let's throw some more people at it, right? How many of you guys have done that or have heard that, right, or have been part of that? Okay, very good, right? All of you have heard that. Many of you guys have read a book called The Mythical Man Month. Well, the basic, great book, right? So read it if you haven't. The basic premise of the book is, at some point, throwing more people at a problem just slows it down, right? And that's absolutely true in technology today. In fact, I think there is a fundamental shift happening in how teams are organized, right? Because of technology and how it's being delivered, sort of happening in concert. So instead of throwing more people at a problem, what we're finding is that you need less people, they need to have different specialization, and you need to change the culture of how you're operating, okay? And most importantly, how you're organizing those teams, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Secondly, what do we do when we have quality problems or we're not meeting some guidelines or whatever? Well, we put more process steps, right? We say, okay, let's do more checks, let's do more validations, let's put more process. In the new world, right, what leaders are doing is engineering automation and actually removing process, because process is often what slows you down. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't have process, not to say you shouldn't have quality checks, but leaders are automating those steps to a scary, scary extent where you can do things like deploy 250 times a day to production. Finally, instead of trying to reduce unit costs and measuring unit costs, we need to be measuring total cost of ownership. So the cost of operations, which is almost never measured when you're building something new, is a critical aspect, because if I can build something in a day, but then we'll take a team of 100 people to operate it, thereafter, that's not cheap, right? That's not efficient. So, what are some good examples of leaders in this space, and what are we doing? What are they doing? This is one of my favorite ones. So Google, right? Google is a very agile organization. They can build things pretty quickly. They can deploy things very, very quickly, their applications. How do they achieve that? Well, how many of you guys use Agile in your organizations? Okay. A lot of people associate Agile with, hey, I can do whatever I want, whenever I want it. I don't need requirements. I don't need documentation, right? Agile is actually the opposite of that. Agile, actually, if you look at companies like Google and how they're doing it, it requires a lot of rigidity in everything but your requirements. Google has thousands of applications in its portfolio. And when you look at the number of architecture styles, the number of architectures they have to support all of their applications, how many do you think they have? How many would you guess? One. They have one. They have one architecture. Be it YouTube, which is a video streaming application, or Gmail, which is a contextual application, or Search, which is, an asynchronous application. All those things run on a single architecture, on a single stack. Why do they do that? And by the way, that stack evolves quite significantly. This is a bit dated as well, but you could see even over the last 15 years, they continue to change their architecture. When they acquired YouTube, I forgot what year it was, like 06 or 09 or something, they transitioned YouTube to this platform in, I think it was 90 days, okay? And they didn't bring YouTube down. Everything at Google runs on this one architecture. What if so if you're a product team, right? What if you're building an application that doesn't run on this? What happens? You never go to production, ever. And you'll probably be fired from Google, right? Because they run everything on this one platform. What does that get them, okay? Well, interestingly enough, Google recently built a data center up in Norway. And the reason they built a data center up in Norway is because they built it in an area where it's cold enough so that you don't need air conditioning, right? Air conditioning is an expensive investment. It's also expensive to operate in a data center. So they built it up there because temperature never gets high enough for them to need to cool the center, except for when temperature does get high enough, right? Because a couple of days a year, it actually spikes. So what does Google do when temperature spikes with their data center? How many of you guys have operated, applications or a data center, right? You remember those 10,000 page operating manuals that say, okay, step 1, bring down server XYZ, kill these processes, and then you can bring down the next server, and then the next server, right? It's like a 3-day process to bring down a data center. You guys remember those? You know what Google does? They pull the plug. They literally have a sensor on the outside that senses temperature, and when temperature spikes, they cut power to the data center, right? And everything just works. Your YouTube doesn't stop, your Gmail doesn't stop, it shifts. Those operational requirements are built into their architecture, and that's why they demand that everybody builds every product on that platform, because that's what that platform provides. It provides that agility, right, and facilitates all those requirements. Google does not hire production support people anymore, okay? They hire guys called SREs, Site Reliability Engineers. These are individuals who are responsible for building the autonomous systems that operationalize Google applications. Netflix is another interesting example of what happens in operations. Netflix, how many of you guys use Netflix? How many of you have performance issues with Netflix? If you do, call your internet provider because it's not Netflix, it's your ISP, right? Netflix, of course, sits on Amazon Web Services, and Netflix uses a couple of interesting applications. They use something called Scryer, which is a predictive analytics application that predicts how much velocity they need to support in video streaming, okay? So they do that using a bunch of information like past history, knowing the schedule of shows that are coming out, right, et cetera, et cetera. And they predict it and spin up additional machines. All happens autonomously, right? This isn't some person looking at an operations manual and doing this manually. The other thing that that Netflix does that I think is very interesting is they use Simian Army to actually test in production. Okay, when you deploy changes to production, of course they're tested beforehand, but what Netflix also does is it randomly kills processes in production. How many of you guys would be comfortable introducing a piece of software into your production environment that does a random kill -9 all? Anyone? Anyone? Netflix does it, right? Remember when we used to build applications and argue and discuss whether they should be triple nine available, double nine available, 5 nines, 10 nines, right? How many nines we should have in our availability. Nobody builds applications that are anywhere near 100% available anymore. But what everybody's building is services that do not go down, right? Applications today are designed to fail and to handle it, and that's why Netflix, and there's other examples too, are comfortable killing stuff in production because that's exactly what they want to achieve. They want to achieve that resilience. This is actually also from Google, an interesting slide about their release cycle, okay? So I'm going to try to use the pointer here. Oh, that doesn't work very well. Did I do that right? Okay, all right, maybe we won't use the pointer. So release lifecycle at Google. This is going back to the point I made earlier about having a different operating structure for how you deliver technology, how you structure your teams. And what Google does is, you know the team that does engineering and development of an application? Well, they also run that application. You don't get to finish when the thing gets deployed to production. You actually run it. So after launch, the dev team, which is the green box, continues to own the application. And it's only when you achieve a certain level of success in production, which is typically a 6-month window at least, okay? You get to hand it off to not the operations team, because there's no operations team, but to the site reliability engineers, okay? And by the way, if there are any manual steps in your process around operations, you don't get to hand it off, ever, until it's all automated. And when your stability, for some reason, goes down and you have issues, guess what happens? It goes back to that engineering team, right? How many of you guys would think about designs differently if you knew you were going to carry that metaphorical pager at night, getting pages when something goes down, right? It changes your mindset, changes your priorities, and it even changes priorities of the business. Because, by the way, these teams, they're not just engineers. These teams include business people. They're carrying that pager at night too, right? So how many of you guys have had a conversation with the business person that says, we can't do this because operationally this wouldn't work. We couldn't operationalize this. How many of you guys have had a conversation with business analysts? And what do business analysts say? Who cares? Right? I just want this to function this way, right? I don't care what happens when it's operationalized. Well, they care if they're wearing that pager, right? And that's what Google does. So what we think leaders are doing, and what we think traditional enterprises need to do, is become liquid. Okay, this is the shift in UIT. They need to become liquid. And there's 3 things they need to do. Number 1, architectures need to change. How we architect systems fundamentally need to change. I started out 16 years ago, my career at Accenture, as a developer, an engineer, an architect, and we used to build these complex monolithic systems. It had N tiers, right? We're following, all these different patterns, and they were very monolithic. They were very complex and large, right? Well, that's the opposite of what's happening today. If you look at applications today, applications are becoming an ecosystem of microservices, both internally as well as leveraging microservices from outside, right, that are now readily available using different standards. They're built, of course, on virtualized platforms, and they're using lightweight frameworks, right? It's the opposite of WebSphere, and the opposite, and I don't apologize to anyone who's a WebSphere or WebLogic fan in the room, but applications are becoming much lighter weight than that, right? So that's number 1. Number 2, we're applying lean practices, we're applying agile tools and agile methods to deliver applications in new and innovative ways. So I'm sure people in the room have heard about design thinking and DevOps and lean practices and different automation tools that create and facilitate the software delivery lifecycle process, making it more autonomous, bringing higher quality to it, and making it simpler, okay? And finally, going back to the operating model, we need to fundamentally shift the culture of how we deliver technology. We need to shift to these end-to-end product teams, right? Not have silos where I do my business requirements over here, and then I hand it off to a bunch of people over here who do design, then I hand it off to engineers, and then I hand it off to testers, and then someone else runs the application, right? Successful organizations today are fusing that all together into a single team. So those are the 3 things that companies need to do. And it's not a binary, it doesn't happen overnight, right? It's not binary. It's not like today I'm solid and tomorrow I'm liquid. It is a journey, and it is a journey that has multiple steps and brings value at each of those steps, right? First, it's about creating more visibility, right? Remember that slide I showed with productivity? It's engineering your teams and process to be able to measure those things so that you know what the problem is. Secondly, it's about introducing automation to create more continuous delivery and learn from the process continuously. Then it's about shifting culture. And finally, it's about the autonomous level of operations that you see from places like Google. So it's a journey. And we're running out of time here, but the last thing I'll say is a little bit of a pitch for my Liquid Application Studio that's out in California that we just launched. So Accenture, because we think that this shift in technology is very important. It's going to accelerate, right? And you're going to see more and more companies spend a lot more time thinking about how they deliver technology, how to make it more efficient, how to make it faster, how to make it higher quality. And, the operating model is important, the architectures are important, the tools are important, how you do that. But what's really, really, really critical in making this successful, what's a real critical success factor, is the culture you create in your teams and shift people's mindsets. And to shift culture, you also need to often shift your environment, right? I actually was very pleased with how these rooms are set up, right? They're very homey, right? They promote a different level of engagement, right? Just by using, residential kind of furniture, right? Like sofas, which you guys with the cheap seats in the back didn't get to take advantage of. But we do think that the environment and culture is very, very important. So we launched this thing called the Liquid Application Studio. We're actually going to launch a bunch of them across the world. The first one's in California. It's got 160 seats. And we've designed a very cool environment, very different environment, different even for us at Accenture, to promote this new shift. So I'm going to show you guys a quick video from the studio. You want to see a quick video? Just to break it up a bit, and then we'll move into questions. So check out more about the Liquid Application Studio online. It's accenture.com/liquidappstudio. We've got some other cool videos on there and stuff. You can learn more about it. But the point is, we think just as important as the tools and the architectures and the methods is the culture and the environment teams are operating in. So we are working with a lot of our clients that are coming into that environment and really transforming their thinking about IT. And I'll tell you guys one quick funny story before, or interesting story before we go into questions, because I think I've got a minute left. So we had a large retailer visit the studio when it was still under construction. Their CIO came and spent some time with us, and the account team insisted on letting them in there, even though we were a construction site. So I said, fine, if he's willing to wear a hard hat, I'll let him in there. We sat down in the studio, and he told me about challenges they've got in delivering technology, right? Resonating some of the things I highlight, in these slides. And I talked about our vision for the studio and, what we want to do there, what our ambition is, what our motivation is. And it really resonated well with him. When he left the studio, he said, thanks, Max, for your time. I don't know what I want to do in the studio, but I know I want to do something here, right? And I didn't think much of it because we're in California, the studio's in California. This client is based on the East Coast of the US, right, which is a 5-hour flight. I know that very well, trust me, I'm based in New York. And he left. So I realized one thing after he said that. I realized that a lot of our clients are going to come to the studio to, deliver some outcome very, very quickly, right? They have some problem they're trying to solve. They're going to deliver an outcome. But just as many clients are coming to the studio not for the outcome. They're coming there for the process. They want to be part of that. They want to be part of that process. And funny enough, he actually called me back 2 weeks after. And he said, Max, are you in the studio the following week? I said, yes, I am. He sent me his VP of Innovation we sat down, we ideated, came up with 3 use cases. And he said, listen, come up with a couple of use cases that we could implement in the studio. I don't care what they are. Just come up with something. We came up with 3 use cases. We actually tried to address a logistics problem they had with their truck deliveries. And we brought in a startup called Glimpse, which helped with that. Because one of the other things in the studio is we're part of the innovation ecosystem in Silicon Valley, of course, which is great. And we're now working to get them into the studio and deliver on those 3 use cases, right? So I think the environment and the culture can really be transformational in how technology is delivered. And I don't think we pay enough attention to that, right? So maybe I'll wrap up with saying that, as you guys heard in Thomas's presentation in the keynote, I think you heard because it was all in Finnish, so I'm not sure that you did, but our tech vision this year is all about the people, right? It's all about the people, it's all about their culture, right? And it's shifting how people organize, gather around delivering technology. Okay? So with that, thanks, and I'll take questions.
So just raise your hand if you have any questions.
Yeah, about that productivity level, how many persons were bug fixes and other coding stuff? So how many persons of ineffectivity caused by bad coding?
You're talking about that example, the productivity example with the percentages. Yeah, so on that team, right, everybody did everything, right? And the way we operated was there wasn't a bug fixer, right? So everybody was doing everything. We didn't break down our measure of what's bug fixes versus how much time you're spending on releases, because that data is very, very difficult to gather. So what we gathered instead is the aggregate, right? So I can't tell you how much of their time was specifically bug fixes versus fixing releases, right? But I can tell you that 80% of their time went to something other than building code, which is either bug fixing, fixing releases, clarifying requirements, I don't know, getting coffee, right? Whatever it was, because they were working 20 hours a day and needed coffee, I don't know, right? But it was an aggregate of all those things. Other questions?
When would we open an application studio here in Nordics?
I get that question every presentation I do for some reason. Right now, we've got, so Accenture's fiscal year runs through August, and our vision is this year to open up New York and London, simply because California, New York, and London are the biggest locations where we have the most clients. And we find that the studio is only successful if we're near our clients who can come in there and sit with us, right? So Helsinki is on the roadmap. We definitely want one in the Nordics. We have a long list of places to open. The next ones are going to be New York and London, hopefully next year, or maybe the year after that.